It began with a single gunshot on a street corner in Sarajevo and ended 4 years later with millions dead and 4 empires in ruins. No one alive in the summer of 1914 could have imagined that a regional assassination would ignite the first truly global war, drawing soldiers from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas into the conflict. It was a war fought with machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, and aircraft, fought from trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. The devastation was so immense that people called it simply the Great War. This is the story of how the world tore itself apart and how the peace that followed helped create the conditions for an even greater catastrophe still to come. To understand how the war started, we have to look at Europe in the years before 1914, a continent that appeared prosperous and powerful on the surface, but was increasingly consumed by rivalry. Nationalism was surging across the continent, with citizens fiercely proud of their nations and empires. At the same time, a dangerous arms race was underway. Germany had built a powerful navy to challenge Britain's naval dominance. France and Germany remained bitter rivals, while Russia expanded its military strength. Armies grew larger, weapons grew deadlier, and European leaders increasingly believed that war, if it came, could be won quickly. That confidence would prove tragically wrong. Adding to the tension was a complex web of alliances that divided Europe into competing camps. Germany and Austria-Hungary were closely aligned, while Italy was also part of the Triple Alliance. Opposing them were France, Russia, and Britain, whose diplomatic cooperation became known as the Triple Entente. These arrangements were meant to preserve a balance of power, but they also meant that a crisis between two countries could quickly involve several others. Meanwhile, European empires competed for colonies, trade routes, and influence across Africa and Asia. In southeastern Europe, nationalism was especially explosive. Europe in 1914 was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then part of Austria-Hungary. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city with his wife, Sophie, when a Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed them both. Princip was associated with a network of Serbian and South Slav nationalists opposed to Austria-Hungarian rule. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and suspected that elements within Serbia had supported the plot. What followed was a month of escalating diplomatic crisis that historians call the July Crisis, a chain reaction that would soon push Europe into war. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began mobilizing in support of Serbia, while Germany backed Austria-Hungary and warned Russia against further mobilization. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia and 2 days later declared war on France. Germany's military plan required its armies to move through neutral Belgium in order to attack France from the north. When German forces invaded Belgium on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany, citing its commitment to Belgian neutrality as well as broader strategic concerns. In less than a week, a crisis that had begun in the Balkans had exploded into a European war involving the continent's major powers. By August 1914, Europe was divided into 2 major coalitions. The Central Powers were led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, with the Ottoman Empire joining later that year and Bulgaria joining in 1915. The Allied powers included France, Russia, Britain, Serbia, and Belgium, with Japan joining the Allies in 1914, and Italy switching sides and entering the war against Austria-Hungary in 1915. Germany's main strategy in the West was based on a rapid offensive through Belgium and northern France, aiming to defeat France before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. At first, German forces advanced rapidly, but the war would soon take a very different form from what military planners had expected. In September 1914, French and British forces made a desperate stand along the Marne River just east of Paris. In the First Battle of the Marne, Allied troops halted the German advance and forced German forces to retreat. The German plan for a quick victory in France had failed. Both sides then raced northward, digging defensive positions as they tried to outflank one another. Soon, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What began as a war of movement had become a war of attrition, fought from fortified positions across a devastated landscape. The Western Front was becoming a battlefield where enormous armies could fight for years while gaining only tiny amounts of ground. This was the Western Front, and it became a landscape of unimaginable horror. Soldiers lived in muddy, flooded, disease-ridden trenches, facing machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, snipers, and poison gas. The space between opposing trenches, known as no man's land, became a killing field filled with barbed wire and shell craters. Commanders repeatedly launched massive offensives to break the stalemate, but modern weapons often favored defenders. Artillery and machine guns could destroy attacking troops faster than armies could replace them. Gains were measured in yards, while losses were measured in tens of thousands. Nowhere was this brutal reality more evident than in the battles of Verdun and the Somme. In February 1916, German forces launched a massive assault on the French fortress region of Verdun. The battle continued for most of the year, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war. Hundreds of thousands of French and German soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, while the front lines moved very little. Then, in July 1916, British and French forces launched their own offensive along the Somme River. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered around 60,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. The Somme continued for months, producing more than 1 million casualties among the opposing armies. Verdun and the Somme demonstrated the terrifying reality of industrial warfare, enormous losses for limited territorial gains. While the Western Front remained locked in bloody stalemate, another enormous battlefield stretched across Eastern Europe. On the Eastern Front, Russia fought Germany and Austria-Hungary across a vast region extending from the Baltic toward the Black Sea. Unlike the trenches of the West, the fighting here involved greater movement across enormous distances, but it was no less devastating. Russia suffered catastrophic losses and struggled with shortages of weapons, ammunition, and food, while military failures damaged confidence in the government. The strain of the war reached deep into Russian society. By 1917, the pressure would help push the Russian Empire toward revolution, transforming not only Russia, but the entire course of the war. The war also spread beneath the waves. Germany deployed submarines, known as U-boats, to attack Allied shipping and threaten Britain's vital supply lines. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The sinking caused outrage in the United States and increased diplomatic pressure on Germany, although it did not immediately bring America into the war. Meanwhile, Britain and its allies launched the Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire in 1915, hoping to open a supply route to Russia and seize the Dardanelles. The campaign became a costly failure, and Allied forces eventually withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, opened several fronts across the Middle East, fighting British and Allied forces in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and elsewhere. Britain also supported the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, hoping to weaken the empire from within. By now, the war had truly become global. Fighting was taking place not only across Europe, but also in Africa, the Middle East, the Atlantic, and parts of Asia and the Pacific. Soldiers and resources were drawn from European colonies around the world. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other territories fought alongside the major powers. A conflict that had begun in the Balkans had become a worldwide struggle. Throughout the war's early years, the United States maintained neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson resisted pressure to enter the conflict, while American society remained deeply divided over the war. But Germany's submarine campaign repeatedly strained relations with Washington. In 1917, Germany announced that its U-boats would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning ships in designated war zones could be attacked without warning. German leaders believed they could starve Britain into submission before American military power could make a decisive difference. Instead, the strategy threatened American lives and commerce, and pushed the United States closer to intervention. The balance of the war was about to change. In early 1917, British intelligence obtained a secret German telegram sent to Mexico. Known as the Zimmermann telegram, it proposed that Mexico should ally with Germany if the United States entered the war. Germany offered support for Mexico to recover territories it had lost to the United States in the 19th century. When the message became public, American opinion shifted sharply. Combined with Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare and attacks on American shipping, the pressure to act became overwhelming. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. America had entered the conflict, but its greatest impact would come months later, when fresh troops and enormous industrial resources began reaching Europe. American entry into the war was a major turning point, but it took time to make an impact. The U.S. military was relatively small and required months to train, equip, and transport troops across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1918, American soldiers, known as doughboys, were arriving in France in large numbers under General John J. Pershing. Their presence gave Allied armies fresh manpower and growing confidence. But the timing was critical. On the Eastern Front, Russia was being torn apart by revolution and was preparing to leave the war entirely. Germany would soon be able to move large numbers of troops west, creating one final opportunity to try to defeat the Allies before American strength became overwhelming. In 1917, Russia was consumed by revolution. Years of war, food shortages, military defeats, and political unrest first led to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II in March. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and promised to end the war. The new government negotiated with Germany, and in March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, formally leaving the conflict and surrendering vast territories. Germany could now transfer large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front to the West. For German commanders, it was a final chance to win before American forces became fully operational. The result was the massive German Spring Offensive of 1918. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched a massive offensive on the Western Front, hoping to break through Allied lines and win the war before American forces could tip the balance. German troops achieved dramatic early gains, advancing farther than either side had in years. But the offensive came at enormous cost. German forces became exhausted, supply lines stretched, and the advance eventually stalled. By the summer, Allied forces were counterattacking with increasing strength, supported by growing numbers of American troops. The Second Battle of the Marne marked a major turning point, and from that moment, the strategic initiative increasingly belonged to the Allies. Germany's final gamble had failed. Throughout the fall of 1918, Allied forces pushed German troops back along the Western Front in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. Germany's allies began collapsing one by one. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September, the Ottoman Empire followed in October, and Austria-Hungary's empire began breaking apart before signing an armistice in early November. Inside Germany, food shortages, military exhaustion, and political unrest intensified. Sailors mutinied, revolutionary movements spread, and Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. Germany's new government faced a military situation it could no longer reverse. The country was isolated, exhausted, and facing the collapse of its entire war effort. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest in France, German representatives signed an armistice with the Allies. The agreement took effect at 11 a.m. that same day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. After more than 4 years of relentless slaughter, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. Across Europe and North America, crowds poured into the streets to celebrate. But there was no simple victory. Millions were dead, millions more were wounded, and entire societies had been transformed by the conflict. The war was over, but the difficult question of what came next had only begun. World War I killed roughly 9 to 11 million military personnel, while civilian deaths from famine, disease, violence, and other wartime causes pushed the overall death toll far higher. Millions more were wounded or left permanently disabled. An entire generation had been scarred by industrial warfare. Large areas of France and Belgium had been devastated, while economies across Europe were heavily damaged. The conflict had also introduced horrifying new realities to modern warfare: poison gas, tanks, large-scale aerial combat, submarine warfare, and industrialized mass killing. The conflict had changed the nature of war forever. Now the victorious powers faced an enormous challenge: how to build a peace that could prevent another catastrophe. In 1919, Allied leaders gathered at the Palace of Versailles near Paris to negotiate the peace settlement with defeated Germany.
The Treaty of Versailles imposed strict military limitations on Germany, transferred territory, established reparations obligations, and included Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which assigned responsibility to Germany and its allies for the losses and damage suffered by the Allied governments and their nationals. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires had collapsed, and Europe's borders were dramatically redrawn. President Woodrow Wilson promoted the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars through collective security. But the peace was already carrying deep tensions within it.
The League of Nations was weakened by the absence of the United States, which never ratified the Versailles Treaty or joined the organization. Across Europe, the post-war settlement left unresolved territorial disputes, political instability, economic problems, and deep resentment. In Germany, anger over the peace settlement became one of several conditions later exploited by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement. World War I itself did not make World War II inevitable, but its aftermath created a dangerous environment in which extremism and aggressive nationalism could grow. The Great War had been called the war to end all wars. Instead, its unresolved consequences helped set the stage for another global conflict. And that is why the story of World War II begins here.